we're going to move into the final panel, and this is a roundtable discussion. And it has, strangely, and this is just the way that it's worked out, a very strong wiki theme, because we have a number of representatives from the world of Wikimedia. Somebody who is familiar with the world of Wikimedia, but isn't necessarily a member of that community necessarily in the strictest sense, is the speaker to my left. This is Dr. Simon Robery, who is a lecturer in Digital Media and Publishing Studies at the University of Stirling. We have Dr. Martin Poulter, who is Wikimedia in Residence at the University of Oxford. We have Ewan McAndrew, who is the Wikimedia in Residence at the University of Edinburgh. And we have Dr. Sarah Thomas, sorry for the spelling error there, Sarah, fully deserved PhD status, who is the Scotland Programme Coordinator for Wikimedia UK. So thank you very much for taking part, everyone, in this roundtable discussion. So what I'm going to do now is just invite our panel members in turn, in any turn that you think fit. So please do marshal the discussion amongst yourselves, and if you need moderation, I will step in and I will give you a warning. No, I won't. But to speak about some of your observations about today's events and yesterday's events as part of this conference, and also in terms of some of your observations about the world of open data, open education, open knowledge, and open access. So we'll start on the far left, Dr. Sarah Thomas.
Hi. I think, there were some really strong themes that have come out of both days. And the thing that was really interesting me was firstly the question of ethics that we were talking about yesterday. There are so much that we can do with open data. Are we also asking the question about what should we do and what we should not do, and aspects of issues of privacy and the public perception of what that means in terms of data and their data. So there was a good chat yesterday, which we sadly missed, about the role of, say, GDPR in raising the profile and raising the kind of public understanding of that data leakage almost. And the second thing which really interested me that has come out consistently over the last couple of days has been something which chimes with something which I keep on saying, which is about making more information and a better quality of information available to the general public. Because if you make a better quality, ideally, or how it should work, is if you make a better quality of information available to the general public can become more informed. A more informed general public can hopefully make better decisions. And we keep getting asked to make quite big decisions on the basis of incomplete and inaccurate data. So ultimately, open knowledge and open data should, in theory, hopefully, lead us towards a better society. So the comments that were made yesterday around the idea of going into a data project whenever you're working with any community with that attitude of positivity, that attitude of we want to help and we want to do something better is this kind of thing that underpins, maybe ideologically, I don't know, but underpins the driver of what we're trying to do, and that just seems to me to keep on coming up everywhere we go, and it's kind of heartening to see that there's still that aspect.
So I obviously wasn't here yesterday, but I would sort of echo everything that Sarah said, obviously. But it's that, I think, it was that idea of the open web somehow becoming a dirty word following sort of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and everything associated with it, and the sort of questions that have been raised of sort of these big digital intermediaries that we experience on a daily, sort of hourly basis about how is our data being used, the ethics of it. And now we're having these discussions a lot more, and from my own background in a university context, and from this morning as well, when you're thinking about Wikipedia and Wikidata, it's about sort of questions of the quality of the information. But for me, it comes down to sort of this idea of creating a constructive open web rather than a destructive open web. And I think Wikipedia and Wikidata are sort of net benefits in that respect. They provide much more in that respect. There are issues, but there are also sort of opportunities for people to engage with these data sources, these repositories of information, and improve the information out there. But if you don't have that information in the first place, if it's not there sort of when you search for a term or try and access it, and you can't control that data source, then you're at so much less of a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you say then that there's that real distinction between a kind of like a free web as in an open web and this idea of free for all, where it's kind of like kind of virgin territory that anybody can just have a land grab on?
I think there is sort of, I mean that's a sort of term that's been used about sort of Wikipedia, that it's sort of the idea of anyone can edit has been used as a criticism. But it's the idea that sort of there are checks and balances to those edits. It's all, the idea is that it should be anchored in what you can say for certain based on the sources that you have. Wikidata is the same. So you add information, but you also add the provenance. Mm-hmm. And it should be open and clear and transparent. It's just communicating that, because there has been this persistence idea that somehow Wikipedia is completely changing all the time, and you can't control who contributes to it. But it's all there in the view history. Everything on it can be checked, challenged, corrected, and reverted back, either by bots or by the human editors that are watching it. So it's not the place it's been made out to be.
Yes, and this kind of ties in with some of the things that you were saying, Martin, earlier on about democracy. So very often we kind of think about data literacy as fostering this kind of sense of empowerment and kind of more localized or kind of ground level democracy. And we associate it with things like Wikipedia, which is a collaborative, open knowledge kind of platform and community. However, it's a different kind of democracy that's at work, right? And so how can we reconcile some of those contradictions or seeming contradictions?
It's counterintuitive, but maybe the most successful model for that gateway to knowledge, well, it has turned out to be in the encyclopedia. Well, Wikipedia's been the most successful. Even though in theory it's the one that doesn't work. It's the one that gets, in theory, overrun by spam or kind of mob mentality. In the early days of the web, Tim Berners-Lee said that there would be kind of information chaos. There would have to be an encyclopedia to organise it, to be a front end to all this information. And there are 9 or 10 different efforts. So great, there's the Hitchhiker's, there's H2G2, modeled on the Hitchhiker's Guide, there's Nupedia and so on. And Wikipedia was the most open one, the one that you could edit without logging in or authenticating, and you could change anything. And that was unexpectedly the one that's become massively successful and the biggest and most popular, and people would be hard-pressed to name any of the others now. And I think we're at a similar juncture with the world of data, that we need some hub and some gateway, some layer between informal discussion in real life and social media and formally vetted, published knowledge. Something to bridge that and a way for people to find pathways through that. And we may find the most successful way to do that is open it up to people to contribute, which is a bit scary, but so long as the design is right. So Wikipedia isn't designed as a Wild West. We've been discussing it's kind of evolutionary. People make changes, but the good changes are preserved and the vandalism is rejected. So long as that design is done right, then it could be a wiki platform might turn out to have a really pivotal central role, not replacing all the other stuff, but as the way by which people find the other stuff. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So what are your observations in relation to some of those issues regarding some of the other things that we've seen over the course of the last few hours?
Yeah, the open mentality involves tolerating a lot of risk, overcoming stage fright, accepting some inaccuracy and incompleteness, and saying we're going to build this plane while it's in the air. And you take that to different areas like data journalism. So there's Wiki Tribune, it's a separate project from Wikimedia, but it's doing fact-checking of stories in the news, but with volunteers, with some professional journalists and acting as moderators. So you don't need to think of data journalism as done entirely by professional journalists or fact-checking by a professional fact-checking body. You can have these public bodies or think tanks or media outlets partnering with the crowd, having the crowd contribute, but again, having them edit each other rather than being a central editor. That may turn out to be the most efficient way to get a lot of this done and to get, to win it through a lot of data to find the knowledge and the meaning.
Great, thank you. Simon?
So some of those issues of quality of data come up a lot as an academic looking at various data sets. And one of the challenges that comes out of this is my main discipline, publishing studies, is not very interested in data and some of the trickier data issues. So for example, thinking about books and editions of books and bibliographical data, there are great data sets out there such as the British National Bibliography that no one in my field is working with. So there are great challenges in terms of this data is there, but how do you get academics to engage with that if there are kind of methodological barriers to what they're doing? And some of the visualization work that Martin was talking about is a good way of doing this, but actually expanding their literacy is quite a significant challenge. And then on the production end, there's this great push towards open access in quite this straightforward approach of, okay, you get your paper about a single line of Shakespeare and you stick that on the web and everybody is going to read this. But actually one of the more important trends within web publishing technologies and the next generation PDF is embedding data within the PDF standard or within a web page. So actually working with sources such as Wikidata and allowing that data to be shared beyond a single flat representation on the page so other people can reuse it. So actually thinking about open access and taking some of those more open approaches beyond here's the text, but also here's the data embedded within that text that you can test out. Because for all the problems that Wikipedia has in terms of its editorial content and these concerns around reliability, academic publishing is just as bad. Peer review does not fact check whatsoever, and people cite somebody who cited someone else who looked at an archive that may no longer exist or may have been incorrect, and there's too much emphasis placed upon the quality of peer review, which just simply is not there. So having more open data embedded within publications and actually taking those wiki-style models can be very useful for thinking about how do we improve the quality of scholarship and how do we improve making this available to the public, because I certainly know that people won't want to read my papers based upon what the peer review process says I have to do to it. So how do we build this audience engaging with these other non-academic stakeholders?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. You bring up notions of peer review within that, because I was reading something quite recently about the development of open access journals and open humanities kind of journals, I guess, where the editorial policy is open peer review rather than blind peer review. So I'm just wondering, and I'll ask each of you in turn, what are your views on that? In what ways does this maybe transform our attitudes towards, kind of the way that knowledge is built in the academy and elsewhere? We'll start with you, Simon, maybe.
So I've had two experiences of open peer review, one of which we opened the comments to everybody and only one person responded and was very cranky, so we just ignored it. The other was somebody who said, cite my own book, as in his book. And I was like, okay, thanks, at least I know that is true. So I'm skeptical about how the model works in practice, because we're still bound by those established practices within peer review, that actually we need to think of new models that are more sustainable and don't just rely on humans, but rely on those kind of fact-checking principles of going to the sources, and this could be automated through bots or in other ways, so expanding the openness of peer review beyond the academy, which doesn't really work in practice in a lot of the models that exist out there at the moment.
I think we're going to have to move from whether something is published or not, the kind of the censorship or publishing model, to a badging model. Even if that's, whether or not that's a good thing, that's what we're going to have to move to, because everything will be published, because it's just so easy to publish a preprint. And in the long term, the commercial interest monopolising particular publication venues, I think, will be defeated. So what will matter is maybe an open process of badging something. This receives a seal of approval from this entity, hopefully with a transparent process, like this was reviewed by such and such an expert, and these are the specific comments. This is already done really well in sites like the archive, where a lot of physics material is published. So you can have people just put preprints there, but then you can define a journal within it and say, well, these papers constitute an issue of the journal, and here are the reviews that show that they're publishable. There could be different systems of assessing different publications by different criteria, awarding badges, and different ways to verify that badge by going to the authoritative source. That requires more critical, independent thought, again, by the consumers. And it's people learning to accept that just because something is online, or just because it's in black and white, or just because it's nicely formatted in a PDF, doesn't mean it's at all reliable knowledge. So that does take education, but that's what we've got to adjust to. That's the environment we're in.
Just to sort of follow on from that, I was just thinking about the sort of the reproductive biology workshop we were doing with students, where we have to explain to them that they cannot use articles that are just published in journals about research studies, where Wikipedia is not the place for current cutting-edge research, particularly in the medical sort of, specifically in the medical field, biomedical fields. They will wait until there has been a systematic review done on, before they will include it as a source, because they feel they don't want to sort of comment on the validity of one individual trial until it's had that sort of extra sort of review as a part of a systematic review. So there is that sort of, that sort of burden if we're putting health information out there, we need to make sure that it is reliable and validated. But it's what Martin was saying as well about the idea of raising the level of debate and awareness, so that there are people that can sort of like be aware that this process is happening on Wikipedia, and that in terms of an article, you don't know necessarily how it came to be. There might be some flawed methodologies put in place, but same with data. You want data literacy. You want people to understand there might have been some flaws to how the data was put together, and just have that critical thinking that's going into everything. And it's about how you sort of empower people in a way that's going to be able them to ask the meaningful questions that are going to serve them better in totality, I would say. And I don't know quite how you do it, but there's definitely a place in schools and in universities and in libraries where we can start to have these conversations. And it's something the field of data science is particularly looking at, getting their students working with real-world data sets to see the process and understand how, visualizations can be created in a number of ways, but also there will be gaps in the data, there will be flaws there that perhaps might not necessarily understand if they are only presented with the visualization.
If I can just go in, so many database courses like SQL courses use as examples. Imagine firm A has invoices from firms B, C and D, and here are the invoices and the addresses. There's now no longer an excuse for using such boring examples in teaching databases when you can get the artists of Ming Dynasty China and the places they depicted, which be the open availability of data should be much more interesting examples of courses.
And so I'm going to pick up on the critical thinking aspect that you were talking about. I think I want people to be as critical of all sources as people tend to be of Wikipedia. There is a huge amount of work, I think, in that kind of seeing how the sausage is made and becoming, and when we talk a lot about when students start to write Wikipedia and start to be involved in that the critical thinking sources, the critical thinking skills increase. This idea of becoming an active producer of knowledge and not just a passive consumer. So I think there's definitely a rich vein to be mined in education, but right from quite early stages. The Scottish Libraries and Information Council is involved with the Scottish Government Information Literacy Forum. I think that's the right words in the right order. And we talk a lot to school librarians and to teachers, and they keep coming back to this. Are young people concerned about fake news? Are they concerned about privacy? But it comes down to this idea of information literacy and at what stage we start to teach that. I feel like we've gone a long way from open peer review, but I think there is that thread about people becoming more active in the production of knowledge and therefore the understanding of how that's put together.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the driver of my question in the first place, actually, was this notion that that peer review shouldn't be a closed system. It should be something that is open, but maybe not in the sense of, again, a free-for-all system like some of the things that Simon has experienced. More like a kind of... more like a system of badges, actually, that you've described, Martin, but kind of much more personalised. So, for example, a peer review system where an editorial board is kind of assigned to a group of articles that are submitted for a special issue, say, and each of the members of the peer review board will give some feedback. Constructive feedback on the article, then the author has an opportunity to respond to that feedback in an open forum, and an actual conversation can take place where the work can be improved, where peer review processes can be improved, and where the content of the journal as a whole then can be kind of lifted. So that's kind of where I was coming from, but so some of those systems of peer review that you've described, Simon, where it's kind of open in that sense, kind of open us up to those unethical practices that double-blind peer review was set up for in the first place, is to kind of stop those kinds of abuses from happening, I guess. So there's some really interesting kind of correlations that are going on between each of the responses there, which I thought were really interesting. One thing that I want to come back to, actually, is the kind of opening statement that you made, Sarah, which is about ethics, because that's kind of my area of interest. I'm really, really interested in the ethics of connectivity and the way in which that changes the relationships between people, within communities, between institutions, and so on. So the question I want to ask each of you is basically, what do you think are the biggest ethical challenges in the open era, and what are the ways in which we can maybe kind of address those?
I'm going to say something around third-party use of data and ownership of data. So we are always, I think it's one of your opening slides actually, we're always creating data. Everything we do, we're creating data. And who collects that and who owns that, and you almost start to get some parallels between copyright and how those things start to work. Yeah, so who owns it? I think that's going to be the ethical consideration of who owns it, and therefore what can you do with that? Yeah.
Terms and conditions.
Terms and conditions are not taking 45 minutes to read.
Sort of people just clicking OK, and somehow that data is like a free-for-all for anyone that wants to sort of use it, scrape it, do what they like with it. I think, we're starting to, have those sort of little cookie pop-ups to sort of suggest, okay, we want to use it in this way, is this okay? But I still don't think we're fully cognizant or have developed a way of sort of really empowering someone to understand and choose, the ability of choosing how their information is shared. I mean, I'm thinking about my own context as well. This is the idea of, like, if someone has placed information in the public domain, is it okay to add it to Wikidata or Wikipedia? If you have a scholarly profile with a list of papers on ORCID, for example, can you scrape that information into Wikidata? If it includes, personal information about where these people worked, or where they are resident, or place of birth, or date of birth information, is that right for that information to be out there? But have they chosen to put it in the public domain? What is the right and wrong sort of amount of information that someone can be comfortable with sharing?
And I guess also then that would be, what are the conditions under which they've chosen to make that information available? So, the context might change, in which case I don't want it available in that context. Therefore, so the right to withdraw information, but how do you kind of ensure that information is withdrawn from all of the places that you're unaware of?
Yeah.
I struggle to think of a more modern analogy. The analogy I'm thinking of is remembering when cameras, you take your film into the chemist to get it developed, and that was the way you saw it, which seems really quaint now. But if the person developing your photos had seen your drunken party pics of your mates and then post that to your employer, and you're doing risky things, driving a cigarette, and send that to your insurer, and to your beach pics, and send them to some random bunch of perverts, then you'd hopefully have some recourse into that if you found that your private personal photos had been used in that way, and they'd been prevented from doing that business. But we're now in a situation in which we can be attacked through our personal private data in so many ways, and we don't have that layer of defence. So, we've got to demarcate that public. Everyone can access it and use it sphere from the private. This is somebody's, even if it's not somebody's property, it's somebody's moral right. It's affected.
Mm-hmm. It seems pretty extraordinary, doesn't it? When you make that analogy, that comparison, it's kind of like, well, we did kind of offer a level of trust to the people who had control of essentially any number of copies of the photos that you gave to them, right? So where is the trust? What's happened to that trust?
Well, I'm going to flip the public-private and kind of recalling a book that I read recently, The Idealist, which was on Aaron Swartz, who famously downloaded lots of articles from JSTOR and all sorts of other opening access to publicly available materials, and think about the proprietary data that we often use and that these corporations store that isn't necessarily personal, but is very useful for understanding the contemporary world. And once you get hold of some of that data for oneself, what responsibility do you have for sharing that, particularly when a corporation does not maintain access in perpetuity? So once that access is gone, it cannot be shared, but is there some ethical responsibility for ensuring that people have access to that data, particularly if it has a broader public use? So kind of thinking about guerrilla open access, and to what extent is this something that we should, as academics, be doing or not doing, and what risks does that have for oneself and career?
It's really quite hard to get a lot of data out of local government. The people who make requests for things like fire hydrants, water hydrants, things like sort of public utility stuff, which a council will have data on, but they don't share it on request because whatever, it's not part of their open data agreement or because of terrorism. You get some weird reasons why they say they cannot release this stuff to the public, where it could go on OpenStreetMap and Wikipedia could go on apps that people are using. So yeah, I think there's a moral responsibility as well as a moral responsibility to protect private information about other people, moral responsibility to release data if we've paid for the service and if there isn't really isn't actually endangering people's lives to share it, then to not make it open and freely usable is to just deny us a freedom, deny us a right.
So it's really about relative harms. That's a really classical kind of ethics argument, I think, right?
But also a guiding principle behind all of the open stuff, open access, whatever. You can't imagine all of the uses that people will find for your stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we can't release this data about local government services because, well, you don't know what would happen to it. Somebody will think of something, somebody will build an app that nobody's imagined because people do innovate and create. And you can't weigh the harm and balance of that because you can't imagine what it is. So to have a presumption in favour of sharing and creating opportunities to innovate.
Yeah, there's definitely something in there about approaches to risk and risk aversion. Yeah. Especially when it comes to local authorities and local councils who tend to be relatively risk averse anyway. Yeah, I would be interested, I think there's also something in there around enforcement. So we have various strategies and various bits and pieces of legislation saying, yes, we should be sharing this is what we should be doing. But I would be interested to see, I think, more activity around, okay, well, if you haven't done this, what's actually happening?
Yeah, there's that kind of question about risk aversion and institutional blockages and breaks. Certainly, it's a theme that's come up again and again the last couple of days. So it's something that we can kind of maybe explore again with this session. Just one final kind of question then, in terms of, I know that you guys all work within Wikimedia as a kind of organisation, but Simon, you've done some work in relation to that as part of your research as well, in terms of online and digital publishing. So I'm just kind of curious to know what you think is the future of kind of collaborative platforms, knowledge building communities that exist online, or as part of a kind of a community of people who use technology to share and build knowledge. What's your take on the future of that, do you think?
Well, I think you can sort of argue that look at the academic publishing model and the way knowledge is produced at the moment. There is a certain lack of democracy to that and sort of access to information, and just exactly what you were saying about Aaron Swartz and but we are obviously more cognizant about sort of some of the moral and ethical issues, and we are starting to have more conversations about this. But I do think there is an argument now that more than ever that sort of we should have knowledge not just in silos, and that there is huge benefit from having one discipline in collaborating with a completely different discipline, one repository collaborating with another repository, and it's about sort of the open knowledge and open data movement and linked open data, sort of being able to empower and added value to the knowledge that's out there in the world. So I think there is sort of huge potentials. There is also risk aversion. There is also an awareness issue as well about that imagination that you could do this. From my own sort of experience, we've been surfacing the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft database for like a static Microsoft Access database that looks at recording all the accused witches in Scotland from 1563 to 1736. And since we've done that project and working with data science students to surface that to Wikidata as a central hub of linked data, we can enhance that data with place of residence information and coordinate information, and we can also link to other instances of accused witches across Europe, and we've been approached by someone about the Salem witches as well. And being able to sort of service this in a machine-readable, multilingual, instantly multilingual format that can then be worked with other complementary data sets is going to be hugely empowering, rather than having it sit in a Microsoft Access database that's not sort of been worked on since 2003.
So everything needs to become interdisciplinary.
I think so.
Yeah.
Or just awareness of the opportunities that interdisciplinary could leverage.
And I think that awareness of we have these different departments or different disciplines butting up against each other, which is always where the good stuff happens anyway. But there's, I think, again, coming back to one of the kind of common themes has been about the gap in skills and the gap in digital skills. So we have risk aversion, but we have risk aversion sometimes because people just, they're saying we don't know what they don't know. So we're not sure about this, so we're just going to go, okay, well, no. So there is an aspect of education and learning and again, this digital skills gap. We keep coming back to digital skills gap and data literacy gap.
I want to say something about contributions. A recurring finding about crowdsourcing platforms is they're incredibly skewed. So a tiny proportion of the contributors contribute a large portion of the content. We really find that again and again with Wikipedia and Wikidata. So one of my Wikidata colleagues, she's obsessed with the moth that's native to New Zealand. And she's done, after a long stretch, she's done all of the moth species native to New Zealand are in Wikidata and these will be used in all these different projects. Thanks to that one person being really obsessive with that topic, whatever it is. There's no one who's obsessed with RADA, the Academy of Dramatic Arts. So she's put the RADA alumni database basically into Wikidata. Now people can query for films that have the most RADA graduates in and so on. If you were to look at the average or the median contributor to Wikidata, you'd get a much smaller, they've tweaked a few things. Really opening up your platform to contributions, you benefit from this kind of extreme end. You benefit from these people who will, in their niche, really exhaust that niche and do a really good job in that niche, and you wouldn't be aware of them or have an opportunity to get any contributions from at all through normal channels. They wouldn't go to an academic journal and publish this. So it's the opportunities for sharing across platforms and combining things from different sources, different disciplines, but also opportunities for maybe somebody will be interested in local politics or in council services, and that one obsessive person will create opportunities, the rest of us create better quality information in our apps and sites.
Essentially through the labour of love.
Yeah.
You need to find the niche finders.
Yeah.
Simon, what's your niche?
Academic publishing, and digital publishing. I think all of this is going on in an entirely different sphere to what's going on in the arts and humanities, and the institutional pressures. So the fact that when we talk about research, it's primarily about outputs, which is the PDF of something, and academics still love their PDFs. So I've done a lot of work on ebooks, and even an accessible EPUB no data would be far better than the system that we currently have. So predicting the future, open access seems to be let's stick everything as a PDF, and there needs to be more thinking about how do we explode that process that happened within, so kind of the peer review process, what actually changed within that manuscript, all those things that we see within the wiki community could be brought in, and they are in certain disciplines. So the British Medical Journal, for example, has open reviews, it has the initial manuscript, it has all the editorial correspondence. So there needs to be a lot more work to actually figure out what to learn from this community beyond the literacy skills, but also how we can take that and challenge this model of you've done all this research, but then it goes into a 10-page paper that 3 people read, when actually the important bit happened before and after that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's kind of challenging that whole notion that academic output is all about that event. It's really about process and about the thought behind that process, and the engagement with constituents or stakeholders or interview subjects or research participants and so on.
Yeah, just to sort of come back about sort of once it's published, and it could then be cited in a Wikipedia page, but it's about that diversity of community, about finding people passionate to do it, and it's such a small community of like 3,400 very active editors. Like, that's Pitlochry trying to curate the world's knowledge. So that we need that sort of people passionate about their subject to add that information. And so what we do at the University of Edinburgh is we sort of teach the students about sort of critically analysing Wikipedia pages and their subject, and sort of like spending a bit of time reviewing the literature about a term from reproductive biology, for instance, that's not yet represented there, and then writing an article about it. So we had one student who wrote about high-grade serous carcinoma, one of the most serious and most common forms of ovarian cancer. No article on Wikipedia. She wrote it, added 60 sort of citations to it from, her review of the material, and it's now been viewed 45,000 times in about 2 years. And because Wiki Project Medicine are very keen that sort of knowledge is disseminated not just to sort of the 4 million, or is it 4 billion people that have the internet, but also to the 4 billion people that don't have the internet around the world. They're also working to translate articles and also have offline versions of medical articles as well. So that one medical article could go around the world in multiple languages, and offline apps, internet in a box, that people around the world could find out about her research and her topic, and it comes back from that paper that someone wrote as well. There's facts from that paper that are now around the world disseminated.
So this is kind of like impact at the level that any academic would be so enviable. It's kind of, that's amazing, because you can actually make a difference through that action.
And you can things like page views and all of that information being transparent and being available, even if, yes, as Martin was saying, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to know where to click if you're looking for those. But because those figures are all available, you really can directly see, okay, yes, this has had this impact. And sometimes it brings up really unusual things. The National Library of Scotland have a range of images that they've uploaded, and I was checking the stats for a workshop, and there's this sudden huge spike on Thai Wikipedia that they have one image that had been looked at a huge amount more times because the King of Thailand had just died. But then you get to see this idea of, okay, we have released information, but this is on a global context. This isn't just about our university or our library or our country. It is very much about that global impact and about the sharing of that knowledge back the way as well, I think is possibly a separate point, but it is important to mention.
That's another thing, actually, that it was mentioned earlier on is the role of libraries in all this. So libraries aren't just repositories for books. They're not just like old, nice-looking buildings that have been turned into flats. They're these places where knowledge is still alive, it's still working. It's not frozen knowledge, right? So
and that have librarians.
Yes, and that have librarians. We have librarians here too, and it's fantastic. And it's that kind of work, actually. Knowledge about knowledge, that kind of meta kind of a way of looking at knowledge that actually creates that sense of community and that sense of real world learning that I think is really interesting. We're coming to the end of this session, but what I would like to do is just maybe offer an opportunity for those of us who are left here to maybe add comments or ask questions or maybe suggestions. Yeah.
That would kill me. Thank you guys so much for that. That was super interesting. Sorry if it looked like I was tapping away, but I'm making friends with everybody in the room online. So I thought that was really great, and I couldn't agree more with what Simon said. So as a social psychologist, we faced an unprecedented controversy in terms of failing to replicate findings called the replicability crisis. So if you want to Google it, that's fine. And as a result, we've had to open up our data and make it public, because what was happening was people were finding studies that don't work and then hiding them in the bin. I mean, also because they couldn't publish them in journals, because journals wouldn't publish something that wasn't novel and innovative and it wasn't media savvy. So unfortunately, what they found is that they're estimating right now about 50% of what we know in psychology we don't actually know. We don't even have a likelihood. So we've got something called the Psychological Science Accelerator, which has just been formed. And you have to register your data plans in advance. You have to lodge them. You have to make them open. What am I going to look at? How am I going to look at it? Who am I going to research with? How am I going to statistically analyze it? And then once I do it, I have to share my data with the world so you can check what I did. Preferably, we can merge our data with somebody in another country to see if it works in another cultural setting, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really great example of how we're starting to take this community open peer review approach that you guys are talking about. And on the other hand, I have a second foot in education. And education data is the complete antithesis of what you're speaking about. So as I'm sitting here, I'm getting emails trying to work with quote unquote open education data. And so some of the things that you guys were saying about data being transparent and open is very much true for some forms of data. I think we've made great strides with health data, for instance. But in other cases, like education, even the open data on the government website is, well, first of all, it's rubbish and patchy and not available less than local authority level, which is problematic for statistics. But even if they say it is like school inspection reports, you can't get to the data behind what's on their website. So you click on a school and one day the report's there, the next day it's gone, this report's here, that report's not. Then you put in a freedom of information request and they say, oh yes, you can have this is open, it's on our website. And you say, well, no, it's not on your website. Or it's not in a usable form on your website. And then they come back and they say, okay, then you need to make a data request. So you make a data request and then they say, oh sure, we can give you that data request. And then 5 years down the line, you're still waiting. So I think everything you guys say about the quality of data, I like what you guys were saying, that it doesn't have to be perfect. The plane might not be made yet. It goes back to Obama's speech where he says, just because there's not a perfect solution doesn't mean we should give up trying. And I feel like that's sort of, I think it's scary for local governments and governments to take that approach, but in order to be truly transparent, we just need to keep pushing, really. So I don't know if that helps or hinders or just my personal rant, because it was a frustrating day, frustrating day-to-day. But it was very timely and topical for me. So thank you all.
I was just going to reflect on a recent podcast that I heard by somebody called Arfon Smith, who's behind the Open Journals movement in America. So it's the oj.org. I'll tweet about it and put the hashtag in for today. But they've got the Journal of Open Source Software, the Journal of Open Source Education, and a couple of other things, one an astrophysics one. And it's a really interesting movement in terms of, so as somebody who's just completed an MSc in data science, the paper that I submitted had brief bits of code in it, but it didn't complete all the code and it didn't have all the data with it because that's not part of the submission. And so the Journal of Open Source Software is really interesting because it allows credit to be given, open peer review of the data and code that's behind papers such as that. So I think it's a really interesting development. I just wondered if you'd come across it or something similar. But it's certainly worth a look at. I'll send around a link to the podcast, which I think is really good as well. So.
There's a category of, so we have Commons, this database of media files, which is actually, it's a sort of document management system. One advantage it gives us, we can have other things, as well as the record about what this image is, we can have additional information, like the code. So there are some data visualizations on Commons. I think there's one of Supernovae, where you can have the image and the code which generated it and the data, or at least the pointer to the data source. So you've got in one thing a completely auditable output, and this can be you could give that a DOI or make that part of the auxiliary materials of the paper. So, yeah, we are supporting, although just not enough people know about it, we are supporting that completely transparent, completely updatable process.
Do you guys have any further thoughts or comments that you'd like to add? Oh, right, we have one.
I want to say that it has been a pleasure meeting all of you and sharing all these thoughts and experience. And of course, we are living in a very different age, talking about education, which is where I have been working most of my life. And what Catherine said about education, the teachers, most of their lives are very isolated. It is funny, but it's weird, but it is a reality, because what a teacher do normally is they prepare, they are work, they go and teach, and that's it. They don't really want to share. That's the reality. And with the students, for example, we don't want them to cheat. We don't want them, to copy. So the thing is that all this of open data is like scary for teachers and for faculties, and it's not that easy. But as you said, it doesn't have to be perfect, everything, but you have it there. In the past, we had to go to the library, wait if the book was available, take the book, find the information, and today, in just 1 minute, you get all of that. So I think, as a teacher, speaking as a teacher, that this is very important, that you promote this, because there are many people that can get, to school, like Malala, and she learned something, she did something out of the website, the internet, on her own. So it can transform the whole world, it to be open. Everything is for everybody. So thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've come to a natural kind of conclusion to the proceedings. So, on that basis, please join me in giving thanks to our panel of experts in the world of online knowledge building, etc., etc. Thank you, guys.